All anime is postmodern. Sure, series that challenge the division between artist and creation and between truth and reality are called postmodern all the time, but oftentimes that analysis derives from an utter lack of understanding about what postmodernity and postmodernism mean, and obscure the postmodernism hiding just beneath the surface of every series you watch, providing the beams on which the house known as anime ultimately rests. Don't get me wrong though, these terms have been used as vague descriptions rather than as rigorous definitions since their inception, so their abuse by underread anime critics is no new event. Most serious scholars of postmodernism define it as a cultural mode, rather than a style of art. In simple terms, it's the form in which culture and life express themselves under what we might call a general postmodern condition. Jean-Francois Lyotard, who's best known for setting out a definition of postmodernity, defines it as the vaguely post-war period we currently live in, characterized first and foremost by that oh-so-famous loss of faith in what he calls grand narratives. Also called meta-narratives, grand narratives are teleological stories about history, meaning stories wherein history itself, and perhaps even nature, trend inexorably towards one purposeful cause, and would always have done so since their very conception. The inevitable return of Christ or establishment of communism are classic examples of grand narratives, though proponents of both, myself included, have often argued against that charge. Prior to World War II, the most prominent grand narrative was that of modernization. It came in many forms: liberal, communist, fascist, nationalist, but unless you were the heir to a sizable aristocratic fortune, you probably believed in it. The Holocaust, which used modern means for some of the most horrific ends imaginable, ended that universal hope. And within the coming decades, all of these grand narratives wherein history was trending to some perfect built-in endpoint came crashing down. At least, that's how the story of postmodernism goes, as told by Lyotard. Without a doubt, it can be argued. Didn't neoliberalism establish a fairly convincing meta-narrative of liberal capitalism as the end of history, one that only really broke apart with the Great Recession? Did China and other periphery states not continue to modernize? Quite possibly, and this causes real problems for the postmodern thesis. Many scholars have argued that postmodernity is really just a new phase in our continued existence within modernity as a whole, and insofar as we continue to live under the rule of capital, I tend to agree. Nevertheless, Lyotard establishes something vital about postmodernity. If we're to use it as a conceptual framework, it simply cannot be used merely to denote aesthetic tendencies in art, the way you might call a building brutalist. It must be used to establish a clear periodization. Okay, you might ask, what the fuck does all of this have to do with anime? Well, let's get back to that initial provocative statement, that all anime is postmodern. Under Lyotard's definition, that would certainly be the case, at least for anything that people in the West call anime. After all, Astro Boy first aired in 1863. Exactly when postmodernity began is kinda unclear, but the shift was well underway by this point, if it wasn't already complete. If postmodernity is a period, and that period is post-war, then in being post-war, anime is inherently postmodern. QED, checkmate atheists. Admittedly though, that statement doesn't actually help us to understand anime or anything else. No, the theorist who truly establishes a base on which to productively call all anime postmodern is Marxist critic Frederick Jameson. Jameson establishes postmodernism as what he calls the cultural logic of late capitalism, the newest stage of this mode of production defined by total globalization, an economic model of mass consumption, and the more fluid movement of capital, especially in the financial sphere. As a cultural logic, postmodernism might be defined as the language through which late capitalist culture speaks, no matter what its creators intend. And it's hard to argue this point, because how could this be avoided? Mass consumption has fundamentally altered what art even is, smashing the high and low culture distinction with a golf club, and sticking popular versus niche art in its place. Global flows of capital have delocalized culture in many ways, creating situations in which the difference between various national and regional cultures are overemphasized in order to appeal to global markets, which want their idea of what a group's culture should look like. As anime fans, we should be especially aware of this one. Aside from novels and newspapers, almost every media form that the average person takes enjoyment from today came into its own after the war. No wonder postmodernism is a useful term for describing our culture under Jameson's framework. Late capitalism's developments have objectively had an impact on the way we experience life, no matter how Marxist you are. What, though, are the notable traits of postmodernism, according to Jameson? For ease of discussion, let's say they're fourfold, which they're really not, but it's close enough. First, there's what he calls the waning of historicity. What this means is that the real historical content of culture disappears. To be sure, media still has a connection to the past. Series like, say, Tolkien Rambu, or even Rose of Versailles draw upon notable moments in history to establish their settings. However, from Jameson's standpoint, this is not history as such, which is characterized by class struggles and sharp contradictions. Instead, it's a simulacrum, or a mere image of what history actually is. A work like Fate Grand Order draws on real and fictional events from the past, but it draws more on objects that we associate with the past than on the actual past itself. Second, postmodernism is characterized by a new depthlessness. This doesn't, of course, mean that the cultural objects we interact with have no deeper content. Rather, it implies that the dominant content in postmodernism is that which lies on the surface. This leads to design trends like minimalism, but can also be seen in the way in which culture has increasingly moved towards scenarios. What I mean by this is that in our era, what draws us most often to a show is its surface elements, the scenario it presents on a high level. Themes and such are important and worthwhile, sure, but alongside style, they faded to the background relative to modernist art, whose scenarios were often banal in spite of their rich depth. To return to Fate, it's the surface-level fact of a war for the Holy Grail between historical figures that draws many to the series. There is more there, and Jameson's statement of trends can sometimes come across as excessive, in acting as if depth has totally disappeared. But it's these surface elements which take priority, something which shapes the works themselves. It's in this context that culture begins to draw endlessly on itself. Anime is a stellar example of that, as countless shows merely reiterate and recombine broad narrative archetypes set out by other works in the subculture. The third characteristic trait of postmodernism is the waning of affect. Affect, here, needs to be understood as something like emotion, though it's not exactly the same thing. To Jameson, postmodern culture has lost all appearance of the ego, and we are no longer able to imagine the individual human situation which leads to a piece of art. This one's a bit complex, and another example of a valid point that can easily be taken too far, but Jameson essentially suggests that in postmodernism, affect is replaced by intensity of emotion rather than its character. Presumably, this would lead to a certain kind of detached melodrama, one which demonstrates an attempt to move the audience rather than a clear elaboration of the artist's own experiences. And well, I don't want to name the shows I'm thinking of because many people care about them, but you know what I'm talking about here. The aforementioned use of character archetypes certainly fits in here, as rather than setting out modernist-style characters presented in order to communicate the real richness of a human being, we're instead faced with generic types, indicative of the new depthlessness. Lastly, of the main four traits, is the breakdown of high and low culture. Which is anime? Well, the whole point is that it doesn't matter. Anime is mass culture, which used to be low culture, but it's often subcultural as well, occasionally even a counterculture, and that's the norm to which all art has trended in the past half-century plus. The avant-garde remains avant-garde, but it's linked to the masses in a way that exclusive theaters never were. I'm fully confident that 200 years from now, if 20th century media is still playable, Mobile Suit Gundam will be recognized as a pivotal piece of art, at least by a cult audience. And that's a show that was produced to sell toys to kids like my lovely fiancé. The bourgeois division between high art for them and low art for the proles is no longer meaningful in a mass consumerist, literate culture. So, that's all four traits of postmodernism, and I'd hope that you can see how they relate to anime and otaku culture. The general trend away from the modernist focus on high art is readily apparent in anime, and while Jameson's language may sound pejorative, it's really not as harsh as it seems. As he says, and as I believe myself, postmodernity, if we're to accept it as a conceptual framework, simply is, just as modernity was, and no return to the past is ever possible. The real question is how we engage with it, what we do with the new tools it offers, and how we work around those it's taken away. Analytic categories invented for realist literature and modernist films will not map one-to-one onto anime, and that's not a bad thing if we retool our critical language to apply to the medium we're actually faced with in front of us. Ultimately, it's not particularly useful to call any specific anime postmodern. Certain series might highlight postmodernity more clearly than others, but if the word's to mean anything, and I'll leave that more theoretical judgment up to you, dear viewer, then no anime is more postmodern than any other. Nevertheless, as an analytical category, it has value. It should alert us to why certain trends in anime occur, helping to explain them on a structural and material basis, rather than as part of merely individual decisions by given creators. Understanding anime as postmodern can present radical new perspectives on the medium, from which we can only gain by examining.